famously, of course, and on behalf of, well, as used by sort of paleocon types, beaten to death is the preface I have to give that he was kind of a contrarian as regarded the National Socialists and Hitler in particular. But funnily enough, the preface for the book is written glowingly and flatteringly. Of course, the man's opinions themselves were quite mixed, and to his credit, he didn't alter anything of the original text, even some mild criticisms of the National Socialists openly he didn't remove or anything. So he was honest in that regard, but he did just kind of append a congratulatory preface. He wasn't too excessive about it. He didn't display particular confidence in Hitler as a person. He didn't even mention him, but he was very proud of the national revolution, as he called it, which overthrew the Weimar decadence. And in that sense, in that negative sense, he was entirely in favor of it. Every step towards Caesarism, military rule, dictatorship was looked upon favorably by him, as long as it was in a national direction. He assigned himself the role of historical expert, which is kind of funny, in quotes. Historical expert, that the men of history, i.e. Hitler, ought to listen to the historical expert who will tell them what to do. In this case, it's self-assignedly Spengler. And he takes on a sort of mild admonition, a role as a cautionary expert from the sidelines. He's not particularly critical, but neither is he particularly jubilant. He thinks the German public is kind of drunk on the successes of 1933 and that they ought to proceed much more cautiously. They ought not to rouse excessive opposition from abroad, which, while sound objective policy, it is a little bit unfair to stress that point too much, given the absolute insanity of the British and French governments and their ridiculous desire for war. It only, it's not quite fair to expect them to have followed a completely moderate course, even though they largely did with regard to Poland, etc. But anyway, he begins his introduction with the statement that this is the grandest epoch in world history, as being the grandest in the Faustian, and the Faustian being the grandest civilization, the most spiritually intense, the strongest-willed race in human history being the Celto-Germanic, to which he assigns Faustian civilization. On a side note, that would be the Nietzschean polemic that the Celts were blondes, which is, as a ruling class, true. But anyway, so he adopted towards the end of his life more of this linear kind of view that each civilization, as it moves south to north, becomes progressively more intense in its spirit, and that culminates in our own. He looked down on unifying universal theories of that kind previously in Decline of the West, but he very much embraced I don't know if I should say reservedly, but in the form of a kind of synthesis, you could say that these civilizations are cyclical and they are worlds unto themselves, but they do belong to a larger process in the same sense as man belongs to the evolution of mammals, even though he is entirely self-contained as such. So you would apply that analogy to the world civilizations and their emergence above pre-cultures and their intensification throughout all world history. So he does leave the side note in his personal notes that maybe something will come limping out of Russia after our civilization falls, but he doesn't really care about that anymore as much as he did in the second volume of Decline. But anyway, our epic, being so grand, he says, corresponds with that of the late Hellenistic period and the expansion of the Roman Empire from Cannae to Actium. He basically places our present era. You might draw a kind of an analogy. It is implicit in there, although not explicitly stated, that England, as representing the transitional period from culture to civilization, might be somewhat analogous with Carthage, representing the transition from Hellenism to Romanism. But anyway, the world wars are, of course, taken by him as directly analogous with the Punic War, the social unrest, the what he calls the dictatorship of the trade unions as being analogous to the Gracchi, although the Gracchi did represent a healthier element of the population, the peasantry, earlier on. But anyway, that's basically, he falls almost entirely back on the classical. He grants that the classical is the closest to our own. At first in decline, this is almost entirely because they are simply the best known to us, but here it does seem to be more so admitted that they are actually more similar to us, as everybody would have known beforehand. I mean, they are Europeans. We shouldn't need to come to that revelation, but evidently he did. Anyway, despite this being the grandest epic in all of world history, the men are absolutely impish in the face of it. There is a relative poverty of human material, and he says that our role at present is to merely consolidate and pave the way for the arrival of great men, that they will have the proper tools at their disposal. I suppose you could make something of an analogy between that and Nietzsche's idea of preparing the home, livestock, and soil, or whatever else he says, for the overman. Spengler would say the only role we have as at present, so long as great personalities are lacking, is to pave the way for them. But he doesn't really see much promise at present. Again, this whole thing was written before the Nazi seizure of power. He wouldn't have classified Hitler as a great man. If he had hindsight, I think he would have had more of a positive assessment, especially relative to Mussolini. But, like I said, in the preface, he grants that he states in advance that all of this is not aimed as an attack at the present national movement, but it is a general sort of pessimism with regard to overall human quality, that there are no ruling classes, there are no great Caesarian figures in the making, according to him, which is largely true outside of, the figure of Hitler himself. You can't really, none of the Prussian generals were up to their role. Very much could have come from Ludendorff, but almost nothing did. He was a little bit too crazy and conspiratorial himself. Most of the accusations laid at Hitler were actually far worse among those around him than his own enemies, including, of course, the members of the SA he purged, but even Prussian generals like Ludendorff, who had ridiculous ideas of him being a Mason or whatever. But anyway, so overall, even among the Prussian aristocracy, all classes taken into consideration, there is a universal decadence. And the great irony or misfortune of our period is the fact that, being the greatest in world history, it is nonetheless that with the most impoverished human material. And this problem can only be, its solution can only be prepared for. It can't be forced. Human material reveals itself. There is no means of stamping greatness on any given population artificially. So this is the general process of high culture, of course, according to broader Spenglerian theory, that it simply exhausts itself in the course of its lifetime. It's not necessarily that the forces from below are such a menacing force that will at any moment destroy civilization. It really is more so that the upper classes simply exhaust themselves, not even in a Darwinian sense. You could say, like, during the Middle Ages, very few of the nobility wasn't really harmed in any kind of Darwinian selection. In fact, Darwinistically, the Middle Ages were extremely eugenic. As for the knights taking each other for ransom, and nonetheless, that aristocracy fell onto decadent times as soon as it was cut off from the sources of its own power, which it might have caused to happen itself. So, overall, throughout world history, you see this disparity between culture and our capacity to maintain it. And he sees this as not necessarily being a purely material process in either a biological or economic sense, but that it unfolds sort of mystically as a result of one's contribution to history. It, in a sense, vampirizes the individuals and populations who partake in it. But this is what places Germany in a unique position. He says Germany, more than any nation, is bound up with the fate of the world. And of course, thus the fate of the world depends more on Germany than any other nation, because it did not yet exhaust itself in the course of the 19th century. Even from, he says, the 14th century on, Germany was basically completely isolated unto itself. In a biological sense, he does say that great men were not given to great works. Instead, talent accumulated in the individual princedoms and consolidated into a very healthy middle class, which resulted in the proliferation of strong human material throughout society to a greater degree than other nations, like say France, where every bright, promising man would have immediately or would more readily have been given to state service or military service or artistic pursuits or philosophy, and therefore rendered himself not only biologically infertile, but in a certain sense as discharging the given fixed potential of his culture. So Germany is taken as emblematic of the sort of Roman force, the Roman archetype in our civilization, just as the Italics were apart from all the turmoils and revolutions of Greece. And internally within Greece, Macedon was apart from all that. It was an aristocratic reserved state. Thus, he takes Rome somewhat analogously to Germany, although I guess socially, the greater overlap, I would say, would be with Macedon as far as preserving the aristocratic, militaristic, ancient, more noble form of rule. Obviously, that doesn't really apply one-to-one. Obviously, all states were relatively bourgeois, but Germany, as I mentioned Ludendorff earlier, it was literally under a military dictatorship by Prussian officers at the end of World War I. A very unique circumstance in all of Europe, and demonstrating its kind of the medieval holdover of its spirit to a degree. But being the representative of the Roman spirit, Germany will naturally lead Europe into Caesarism, which is simply put, it's the rule by individual men and their armies who are personal retinues, no longer by national armies, as in the 19th century and analogously the Hellenistic phalanx, the mobilization of masses of men in Greece. I don't know if that's completely equivalent. You could say the hoplites were more of a militia than the phalanxes, but at any rate, the massification of warfare, mass national standing armies, he predicted as giving way to professional, narrower armies serving as the personal retinues of great men. You could say that World War II prevented this hypothesis from being tested in the sense that every nation had recourse to mass conscription by necessity. So, if any one of them had won and consolidated its position in the world, maybe you would see this kind of privatization of the army and its use for personal political ends and its distance from the citizenry as the latter sort of decays and becomes indifferent to politics entirely. But this this emergence of military rule, he attributes to the reemergence of the healthy elements lingering within the population. It isn't exhausted yet. This isn't the picture of the despotism of, say, late Rome, of after the establishment of the empire. This is the despotism of Sulla, Marius, Pompey, Caesar. It's the population still contains vital bloodstreams. There's still great political action to be expected. There's still a latent vitality in the broader population, such as would not exist after the final consolidation of civilization, according to his model. But reemerging from the healthier classes, as I said in Germany, he said the middle class there was uniquely healthy compared with other European countries. Emerging from the peasantry, from the good, unused particular streams of blood, there will come the soldiery, which will serve the future Caesar, in reaction against the city, in the reaction against mob rule, in reaction against petty rationalism and the organization of society by mere paper schemes. There will come the instinctive revulsion of military natures who will take the state for themselves, and the beginning of grand politics, the shaping of the state according to a single will. And going along with this, as I've kind of just hinted at, is a fundamental philosophy, which is that of skepticism with a K, not with a C, but with in the Anglo context, but with a K, which he calls the fundamental doubt as to the meaning and value of theoretical reflection, reverence for the facts of world happening as they actually present themselves livingly. This isn't a quote, but what I've sort of condensed. the inmost secrets of the world are taken as describable but never explainable. So this is sort of the way paved, arguably, by Nietzsche with his critique of reason. You could call that, I mean, not in the Kantian sense. It's actually of course, that's the opposite of Kant. But his criticism of reason as an end unto itself, the idea that the human intellect is capable of encompassing the entirety of the world, the idea that in the political context that certain systems can merely be artificially imposed on the world and contrary to all lived historical experience. Instead, skepsis, as Spengler and later Yockey took it, was this almost mystical reverence for the world as in a sense, a living organism, that organisms have inherent living laws. For instance, if you were to confiscate property en masse, what effect does that have on the will to possession? Whether or not you would desire it, whether or not the state could make use of any given lump of resources, what is the effect on the human organism? Thus, of course, the disgust of the peasantry, thus the rise of Caesarism. The history is played upon by instinct rather than reason, and there's certain elemental forces which are beyond reduction and criticism, and certain elemental drives and desires which are embodied in their most intense form, as I said, in the Nordic race, which has a unique drive to power, possession, genealogical continuity. But anyway, our Faustian civilization, he said, is threatened by what he calls the world revolution, which has two branches: the white revolution, which is that of the white population internally, and the colored revolution, which is obviously from without. Now, the white revolution, he takes as analogous to the decadent philosophy and decadent politics of essentially all civilizations internally. It's the result of agitation by literary figures and by professional revolutionaries, agitators. He sees this as beginning essentially with the French Revolution, or just prior to the French Revolution, with certain social theories. Notably, he mentions Rousseau and a certain belief in inherent human equality. But anyway, politically, practically speaking, this results in the co-option, or the commandeering, you could say, of certain rightful bourgeois or even aristocratic indignation at the French monarchy. This is taken instead into plebeian excesses, which have nothing really to do with the reformation of the ship of state as advocated by such men as Mirabeau or even de Maistre, who was a moderate revolutionary at the beginning. Anyway, so he takes as separate from the bourgeoisie, as essentially separate from the basic notion of state reformation as they occurred in the Roman Republic, from the professional agitation of mob leaders, of theoreticians, and he takes these figures as, of course, basically being embodied by certain Jacobins, not necessarily the early Jacobins. Again, he has a certain liking for Mirabeau, but essentially, these types exhausted their potential. They were obviously overthrown by Napoleon in a sort of prefiguring of Caesarism. But anyway, they moved from the basic agitation, the misdirection of the bourgeoisie, and the use of the uncoordinated use, basically, of the Parisian mobs. This type then moved gradually through socialism and communism to an active and exclusive focus on the mob itself. In the theory of Marx, of course, essentially the deification of the proletariat, which Spengler takes as not existing organically, but as having to be created artificially by the propagandizing and the demoralizing of certain elements of the working class and their fusion with criminal, non-working, lumpenprole scum into a single body, which is to be used for revolutionary purposes, contrary often to their own interests. For instance, insofar as it opposes colonial policy, as an example. But he sees this as basically having been played out, ironically enough, because it won. Because with the end of World War I, these elements gained the victory. He calls Germany essentially ruled by its trade unions. There is no greater fear in public opinion than of blasphemy of the worker. There's the government is held in hostage by unions and by parties who demand tribute for their voting constituencies. Obviously, modern America is a far more intense example of that. But anyway, the bourgeoisie doesn't really rule. It's more a sort of coordination between finance, capital, and these proletarian parties. Not necessarily that they always have the same interest, but that they are both mutually plundering the state. They're both plundering the army, the conservative forces of society, the peasantry. They are throwing away foreign policy, on behalf of their own personal interests. They are both advocates for the international, one of course finance and the other of labor. But thankfully, he says the time of this is drawing to an end because simply its possibilities have been exhausted. It has attained victory. It is decadent. People are exhausted with it, much as Napoleon was hailed very easily as ruler of France simply because the public was tired of revolutionary antics. So in our own age, these types and their various schemes will be simply ignored, much as happened in Germany. I mean, they were completely content for Hitler to be dictator. There was no contradiction in the mass mind really between democracy and the democracy choosing its man, which is, of course, more of a Schmittian kind of idea. But anyway, this is something of an organic process. This revolution is only really dangerous insofar as it might be coordinated with the colored revolution from without or by certain subversive elements. In and of itself, it's entirely uncreative. Its role is completely destructive and can make nothing for itself. So he says Germany could only really be salvaged by austerity measures, by the repudiation of all of this. Of course, National Socialism was a step in that direction, but as the name implies, not entirely so. Of course, they had to win elections, so it's completely understandable. But he saw in the long run austerity as being the first national necessity, as being essentially unpopular but necessary and having to be enforced from above by force of arms, not really being not being democratically enactable, suffice to say. So once the Caesarism of the future is fully set in, this sort of reform will be possible. But anyway, so as I said, the only reason the world revolution really matters to him is because of its potential coordination in an existential sense. The only reason it matters is because of its potential coordination with what he calls the colored revolution, which would include Russia as give me 1 second. I'm sorry. Russia, as he says, as emblematic of Asia, the spirit of Asia, the unexpressed sort of Eurasian steppe pre-cultural thing with which he lost enthusiasm for, as I said before, but which he still claimed to be essentially independent from the West. Of Japan as essentially an offshoot of Chinese civilization, but which nonetheless possesses race to a very great degree. He calls the samurai perhaps one of the strongest cases of race in all of human history, one of the most admirable examples, essentially possessing a Nordic spirit, a northern spirit. As I mentioned earlier, the progression of civilization from south to north, its intensification. But anyway, he is a little bit, I don't know if you've seen the poster of Spengler sitting writing all this down, but there's a good kind of funny poster of Spengler writing, I think, Hour of Decision with, with extremely stereotyped like Turkmen and Negroes standing over his shoulder with scimitars. And that pretty well encompasses his view. It is really over the top, excluding the most important examples of Russia and Japan. He got a few things wrong, but not so far off. But I mean, he thinks that there's this genius Indian race stretching from Mexico to Peru that's going to take up the scepter any day now. Any day now, they're going to take up the scepter, and with their cunning of an old civilization, they will enact their revenge. But I'm not really seeing that, and we haven't in our own time seen any examples of this. So that was a little bit far off. Same thing with Africa. I mean, there's literally zero political will there, except as they were being coordinated by Moscow, which, to be fair, he did describe thoroughly. So he underestimated the Chinese to a degree. He said they could never be a power except being governed from without. Now, that is true insofar as actual international imperialism is concerned, but they have proved that they are capable of managing a fundamentally independent state, which he said they would not be. India, yeah, we all know India. India's not really going to be doing anything anytime soon. Basically, his idea is that all fellaheen peoples like that are completely incapable of partaking in world history. And while a population like Japan might belong to a now Felahinized culture intellectually, it still possesses strong race instincts. It still possesses a national idea. And while a place like Russia is barbaric and pre-cultural in a sense, of course, again, it still possesses a sort of reservoir of race, a reservoir of instinct, such that it might play a part on the world stage. He says that the Russian Revolution was essentially Russia's reversion to Asia. It was an attempt by a Western intellectual stratum. I wonder what that means. Western intellectuals. I hate Western intellectuals. But he said it was an attempt by a Western intellectual stratum to use the peasant hatred of the Russian for Petrin society to their own ends. And to this end, of course, the bureaucratic dictatorship, the starvation of the peasantry, the continual mistrust between the two. He says Lenin is kind of a proto-Caesarian figure. He was, like Mussolini, rather flexible. Of course, the new economic policy and all that, he was quite flexible. Stalin, he takes as a cunning Asiatic, which of course Hitler did as well, essentially a Khan of sorts, governing a horde, an extractive horde on top of a dispossessed peasantry, for the moment still attached to Western intellectual ideology of Marxism, but only conditionally so. For his particular clique, it's necessary, and for the sake of international diplomacy, it's useful. For the sake of the subversion of foreign countries and the projection of power abroad, it's useful. But internally, he says Marxism will have its day; it will be overturned endogenously. So again, Stalin represents a return to Asia, but practically speaking, he does preserve elements of original Bolshevism, which is an urban ideology which allows for a centralization and modernization of the state, which otherwise might not have been possible relying purely on endogenous Russian forces. So it was, in a sense, merely the replacement of one Western conservative government with a revolutionary one. Again, it's a little bit much to call that completely Western, but certainly ideologically there's truth to that. Whereas the Russian himself, could sympathize with either. He could have a religious, primitive attachment to the Tsar, or a hatred of the Western Petrin society, such as would have led them over to the Bolsheviks, and a hunger for land as well. Okay, so he says if Russia embraces that nationalistic form of Bolshevism, with funny, they will immediately become a great world power to a far greater degree. They will be able to project abroad directly. They will actually expand their frontiers. He says that any invasion of Russia from the West is foredoomed to fail. Of course, it's easy with hindsight to agree with that, although I do think if Japan had gotten involved, it would have been quite doable. But invading from the West being unfeasible, I guess that's basically true. But likewise, he says Russia, because of its internal instability, because of the diversity of its constituent elements, it is incapable of directly projecting power abroad. And of course, this was proved true for the time being. It was incapable of doing so. I already mentioned Japan. His exaggeration with regard to Japan is that as soon as they defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, that all the Negroes in Cape Town were shucking and jiving with joy that Japan is a third worldist international symbol of resistance to the white man, which really is not true outside of Asia. He really clings on to like individual anecdotes, like the fact that certain propaganda leaflets are found or whatever. He really attributes a little bit too much to that. He's a little bit too eager to make a grand picture and to stereotype and flatten out the people he's describing. But again, with regard to the Japanese, there is more nuance there. He thought they would be unassailable from the Pacific, for instance, which was completely false. He didn't understand naval world strategy so well, but what else do we expect? We don't expect perfect predictions from the man. It was largely true, only in the sense of his overestimating the colored world, like as a proper noun. Only as far as that scaremonger is concerned, was he wrong? But he is correct that in order for the the white revolution to take a final toll on Western civilization. It would have to exist somewhat in concord with the colored revolution from without, that either on its own was completely impotent and would be easily liquidated in the first case or imperialized in the other. So part of what I wanted to do here was talk about 19th century history and how it could have gone better according to Nietzsche and to some degree, or according to Spengler and to some degree Nietzsche's vision. I didn't finish reading that book about the 19th century, however. I'm so sorry to say. But Spengler does like to make mention of various historical possibilities unfolding there. And I do have some preliminary knowledge. I think it would be a little bit interesting to discuss how things might have gone more according to his view. With regard to World War I, well, actually, to start chronologically, I already covered the French Revolution somewhat, how he saw a positive, moderate, constitutional monarchist element embodied by people like Mirabeau. In Napoleon, he saw a purely military seizing of the state by a foreigner, by an Italian, much as, I mean, in a horribly distorted and not really equivalent sense, but you could say, Stalin taking hold of the Soviet Union as a Georgian and letting in his fellows. Not equivalent, obviously, at all, but, the basic fact that in revolutionary circumstances, foreigners have an easy time stepping in and taking things in a completely new direction. In the case of Napoleon, that was the institution of military rule and the reconciliation with conservative elements, the inviting of royalist generals back. He announced himself as his grenadiers marched into whatever the assembly at that time was called, that the revolution was over and that he had ended it. He doesn't see him as an ideologue of any kind at all, a purely pragmatic man. Again, a Renaissance nobleman who set up his quarters in Paris is essentially how he's characterized, very similar to Nietzsche. And of course, he mentions as well, actually, how Napoleon lamented the absence, in his case, of a dependable, reliable officer corps. Of course, half of them were killed off and many of them were exiled. Some of them did come back at his invitation, thankfully. But he lamented that he didn't possess the chivalrous, loyal, obedient tradition which the Austrians did, for instance, in the case of their own nobility. Again, sort of the Nietzschean picture of revolution, that it results in eccentricities. It results in the very lowest and very highest elements expressing themselves, but at the cost of, in this case, the extermination or disenfranchisement of a reliable, noble element, which was very useful in the case of Germany. And as I mentioned earlier, Spengler referring to that as the sort of bedrock of its racial quality. What else? So French Revolution, entirely negative view of the Jacobins. They're basically communists. He hates them, except for maybe the early Jacobins. With regard to the 19th century, following the Napoleonic Wars, France's human material is almost completely exhausted. Obviously, they were spent in foreign expeditions. And, you could say spiritually, the entirety of its possibilities of its soul had already been played out. But, of course, this leaves Germany as basically the heir of all of Europe. But unknowingly so, disunified, provincial, backwards, but for all that, as I said earlier, possessing a great reservoir of blood and great potential for the future. He saw the wars of liberation as a decadent phenomenon, a mere mirroring of the French Revolution by Germany in favor of itself. Nietzsche, of course, did the same thing. Again, Napoleon as the exceptional individual, he ironically roused those forces he claimed to represent against himself in his own foreign expeditions, especially in the case of Germany. And I will add, by the way, with regard to Iberia and Sicily, the elements there aligned with him. Spengler takes that sort of division as racial rather than ideological. He takes Andalusia and southern Italy as essentially non-white, which is Keck, and that's why they hated Napoleon. But in the case of Germany and other purely Western nations, it was. Unfortunately, there was an absorption of the ideology of the attackers by those who were fending them off. As to how German history could have unfolded better, I mean, he's almost entirely favorable to Bismarck and his vision. His only criticism is that he did not properly train the coming generation, which of course cannot be entirely imputed to him. Wilhelm II was a total retard. He mentions how Bismarck was entirely dependent on the ear of the king without the conservative aristocratic tradition there. A man of his type probably would have been, as in France, overshadowed by a crowd of mediocrities. Again, it's only in the case of a revolution itself that great men shine forth. But in the immediate aftermath of it, one has bureaucratic, bourgeois mediocrity, such as existed in France at the time. But in the case of Germany, because of that aristocratic tradition, personal patronage, personal sponsorship still existed. And the House of Hohenzollern was healthy enough at that time, at least, to produce decent enough kings, and for these to have for Bismarck to have their ear. Of course, he's famous for his moderation and his conservatism. He threatened his neighbors at times as a means of getting his way. He threatened France with the adoption of the Frankfurt Constitution, essentially, and the total unification of Germany, the alliance of the House of Hohenzollern with liberal elements, nationalistic elements, which would have resulted in the total destruction of Austria and the total upending of international order. The end regime would probably have been moderately conservative or something, but they would have embraced those sorts of forces and given them a door. They would have given them an open door to higher halls of power. He threatened outsiders with that, but I mean, that was probably empty. For the most part, he was completely opposed to those forces. I like to ponder myself what would have happened if the Kaiser had been friendly to the Frankfurt Constitution, amended it somewhat, made it conservative and stable, but liberal enough to affect German unification. I like to think about that and what an alliance with Russia might have resulted in, how the rivalry by the time of World War I could have been completely prevented if Galicia and the Balkans had been left in their sphere. Spengler's praise for Bismarck, it makes sense entirely within the narrow period concerned within the 19th century, the balance of powers, the necessity of maintaining some degree of stability internationally. But it did allow for, in the long run, it could have, in a sense, made things worse. Issues which could have been resolved were left unresolved, such as I said, Galicia and the Balkans and the Dardanelles. Bismarck was, in a sense, assuming that there would be proper material in the future to make use of his schemes. I mean, he wanted friendly relations with Russia. There were plenty of conservatives in St. Petersburg who reciprocated, but the Tsar, like Kaiser Wilhelm II, was a retard and was not open to that. Although he could have been swayed had things gone differently. That was prevented by Wilhelm being excessively friendly with the Ottomans. Anyway, point is, cut a long story short, politics, in the absence of individual exceptional men like Bismarck, is essentially meaningless, takes meandering, stupid courses. The attempt at an alliance with Britain, the attempt at an alliance with the Ottomans, the alienation of Russia, all of that was completely unnecessary and completely ruined Germany's long-term prospects. It turned the northern half of the Eurasian continent into a permanent enemy, which is probably the worst thing that could have happened when that was completely unnecessary. So I will do more reading in that regard, and I might do a separate space on it, but that is essentially the point which Spengler makes, that without the singular men of the stamp of Bismarck, our own civilizational period, the most intense, the most profound in all of world history, has only impish figures dancing around blindly without any greater scheme in mind, unfortunately. In the case of Nietzsche, I mean, that great scheme would be pragmatic as well as idealistic in its envisioning of distant, far-off futures, of creating the overman of millennia-long Reich or whatever. But in the case of Spengler, too, the broader vision, the subordination of all immediate party interests to long-term geopolitical ends, as I said, for instance, taking the northern half of the Eurasian continent into account, that Russia must either be completely contained from without or be completely aligned with unconditionally. So anyway, stepping on from that, World War I, that all that resulted in a horrible mismatch of powers. As Spengler saw it, Germany could have just supported Russia over the Dardanelles, helped them keep down their Polish population, maybe offer them Austrian Galicia or something, and they would have been long-term friends. They would have been indivisible allies forever and ever. But that didn't happen, and there was a grotesque mismatch of powers, as I said. Austria really did weigh down Germany. It attracted two whole enemies, although it did perform all right. The German element in the Austrian Empire was quite fine, but it was a drag in a certain sense. Anyway, World War I, grotesque mismatch of powers. He says England, it's all England's fault because the perfidious Anglos want to eternally cripple Germany's economy. But ironically, just as with World War II, supposedly being fought in defense of the British Empire, all will to actually see this aim through completely evaporates with a victory. As we all know, nothing followed on Versailles. The Brits were moderate, even though, maybe Spengler's correct. They did want to cripple Germany long term, but they had no desire to see it through, rightfully so. There was no reason for them. There's no way to enforce that permanently. That wouldn't make sense. It would just result in France gaining an excess of power. And the excesses with regard to Hungary as well. Britain was a more moderating influence there, in Silesia, in East Prussia, etc. It's funny, as soon as the war's over, they sort of lose their wind. But anyway, so he sees the perfidious Anglos is basically at fault. He says America was brought into World War I because of English propaganda and financial interests. I will add the retarded idealism of men like Wilson and, of course, certain Magian elements, which obviously had their own interest in the Ottoman Empire. What else is there? World War I, grotesque. Doesn't like it. Very bad, understandably. World War II, I already mentioned Hitler at the beginning. You fellas are going to have to re-listen to that. Haha. But his assessment obviously was skewed by familiarity, by proximity. As I said, he was sort of gushing over Mussolini. He called him cool, cold, rational, calculating, Napoleonic. But, of course, we all know how the war went. We all know the stupid things he did in the Balkans and the poor conduct of the Italian army overall. He says that the first task of the great man who gains power by revolution is to liquidate his own party. And guess which one of the two did that? It wasn't Mussolini. One of them did that, and he did it was kind of excessive, but that wasn't his fault. I'll have to read up more on that. Maybe we'll do a separate book club about that time period. But only one of them did a proper purge, and continually did so. And he had good military instincts, of course, with regard to the Ardennes. His own Prussian staff was largely decadent and incapable of thinking far into the future. Manstein, of course, he adopted Manstein's plan. He did have enough talent at hand to see that through, thankfully, but that would be the sort of German reservoir of blood buoying him up. It might be just because Mussolini was such an exception to the Italian character, to its general depletedness, that he gave such high praise for him. Maybe it was just the sort of shadow cast, the sort of greater disparity there, but little bit unfair, quite substantially unfair. And of course, with anti-Semitism as well, the rhetoric, you could say, internationally, it was excessive. It caused greater hostility than was necessary because, of course, Hitler in the early years was completely moderate. Shockingly moderate about all of that, and made plenty of overtures with Zionism directly. But you could say the international rhetoric had unintended effects. But as far as actual conduct goes, again, as with Poland, it was completely moderate. It was reasonable. He wanted an alliance with the Poles against the Russians. And under those circumstances, maybe he would have confined Lebensraum to the area of the Baltic, which I think is reasonable and would have been the best course anyway. But of course, none of that happened because all of his enemies were suicidal retards who had no interests, no commitment to their own long-term interests. But even though that was the case, it was a fact, and a fact that had to be reckoned with. And in hindsight, of course, we can offer our criticisms. The faults of Molotov-Ribbentrop, that he should have been clearer with the Japanese. He should have made sure the Northern strategy prevailed over there instead of causing a cabinet collapse. All that sort of thing. Should have been grander, more consistent geopolitical thinking along those lines, perhaps, focusing fundamentally on one objective and sacrificing everything else to it. But that's easy to say in hindsight. And given the circumstances, it was relatively well conducted. again, how are we supposed to account for the suicidal nature of the British government? It's a very poetical work, very hopeful, very good. He says the forces of which will sway the future are none other than those of the past, the will of the strong race, will to possession and power. All idealism will be destroyed. He foresaw the total philosophical overturning of Europe, the ideological overturning. He foresaw many things. He said new nations will form by common feeling rather than the stupidity of merely similarity of language. England and France are exhausted. Germany, of course, being the only power left to establish the Imperium Mundi, just to concludingly go over everything. The colored revolution is a mere negation of the West. The white revolution is a mere negation of the culture-bearing stratum within the West. But anyway, point is, it ends very hopefully. It ends very poetically. Caesar's legions are assembling. Great men will cast the die, and all we can do, as he said, is to wait for them, to prepare the way for them, to make every possible convenience for their sake. Who could have predicted Donald Trump, man? Who could have predicted Donald Trump? That changed everything. We could have done a better job preparing for him. We could have made things easier for him, but nobody could have predicted exactly when he would come and who it would be. And that's basically his advice for the future, to prepare the way for the unforeseeable overturning of things and the arrival of particular personalities. And I think that's it. I think that's it. You know what? You know why this one was so good? It's because I wrote it out. I've made my big old note sheet. And I did that for you because I love you.